Today I want to talk to you about how we make God first in our lives instead of just giving Him the leftovers of our lives. There's a country music song that came out years ago. It's a very popular song by Willie Nelson. It was called "You Were Always on My Mind." And the lyrics to the song go like this: maybe I didn't hold you all those lonely, lonely nights. And maybe I never told you I'm so happy that you're mine. Little things I should have said and done, I just never took the time. But you were always on my mind. You were always on my mind. Yeah, all the Willie Nelson fans are here today, aren't they? Can I tell you something about that song? If I were a woman hearing that song, I think I'd want to gag. Because any woman that I know, that would not fly with them. You know, if I ignore my wife for months at a time, I don't think she's going to take any consolation in the fact that she was always on my mind. Because see, if you really care about somebody, you're going to show them that you care about them. If someone is really always on your mind, it will show itself to be true in the way that you treat them in your actions. Somebody once said it this way: you can give without loving, but you cannot love without giving. And so today, as we wrap up this series called Economic Atheist, I want to talk to you about one of the most significant and most tangible ways that we demonstrate to God our love and gratitude for His presence and His work in our lives. Let me do just a little bit of review. We began this series 2 weeks ago. And as we began this series, I just gave you one very important principle that's foundational to everything else that we've been talking about. And the principle goes like this: I am not the owner. I am not the owner. Like, we come into this world empty-handed, we leave this world empty-handed. Ultimately, in the truest sense of the word, we own nothing. God owns it all, and He allows us to manage some things for a brief period of time, and someday we will give account to Him for how we have managed what He's entrusted to us. And a couple of weeks ago, if you were here, you know that as a way of reinforcing this principle, we gave everybody some money to go home with, a little bit of money to manage in a way that would honor the one who had given it to them, to steward it in a very wise way. And I'll tell you what, it's been a blast to hear what people have done with that little exercise, that little homework assignment. We've gotten literally hundreds of reports back, either online or through the little blue cards that we handed out. Let me just tell you 3 more things that people have done with that little homework assignment. Stephanie Decker, who attends our Dixon City campus, was given $1. And so on her Facebook page and among her friends, she found 175 other people to match her $1. And they're going to give that money to United Neighborhood Centers to give Thanksgiving meals to a number of families. So that was a really cool thing to hear about. One of our community groups actually pooled all their money together that they had received in church. And their goal was to buy a goat for a poor family living in a third world country through an organization called World Vision. And so they pooled their money and then came up with some very creative ways to enlist some other people outside their group. They actually came up with over $200, which is enough to buy 3 goats for families in third world countries. And then I got this email from somebody. It says this: with $2 in hand and a challenging message on our hearts, my wife and I decided to look over our finances to determine if we are being good stewards of God's money. We decided that going out to dinner several times a week would be better spent on someone else in need. And he goes on to say how they took the $2, then took the money they would have spent going out to dinner, used that to buy a new pair of glasses for a coworker who was desperately in need of a new pair of glasses but couldn't afford them. And then the email ends by saying this: but it won't stop there. Thanks to a challenging message and the generosity and example of the leaders at Parker Hill, we will continue to sacrifice going out to eat so much and find someone who is in need. And I'll tell you what, we got hundreds of stories like that, and I just want to say thank you to so many of you who took that so seriously. It's been a blast to see what you have done with that. Today, we want to continue this series, want to wrap up this series, and we're going to talk specifically today about generosity. We're going to talk about giving. Let's have a hand for talking about giving in church, all right? You picked this Sunday to be here, yeah. And some of you might say, well, Mark, why would you spend an entire message talking about giving? One simple reason: God so loved the world that He gave His only Son. See, If you are a follower of Jesus, then giving has to be part of your DNA. The way that we know that we are truly in love with Jesus, the one who gave everything, is when we become generous-hearted givers. The way that we know that we understand the gospel is when we begin to give to others the way that we have been given to so graciously. It should be as natural to us as breathing. I subscribe to a leadership journal for pastors, and a while back there was a story in there from a pastor by the name of Eric Holstrand out in North Dakota, and a true story. And he says this: "While I was preaching one Sunday, an elderly woman, Mary, fainted and struck her head on the end of the pew. Immediately, an EMT in the congregation called an ambulance. As they strapped her to a stretcher and got ready to head out the door, Mary regained consciousness. She motioned for her daughter to come near. Everyone thought she was summoning the strength to convey what could be her final words. The daughter leaned over until her ear was at her mother's mouth. 'My offering is in my purse,' she whispered." How committed are you to being a person of radical generosity? And by the time we get done here today, I'm going to ask you to consider where you are with this whole subject and to ask you to consider your level of commitment to God's mission in this world if you are a follower of Christ. Now, if you're new here, just relax, okay? This talk today isn't necessarily for you. We're glad you're here, and you get to kind of listen in on more of a family talk, and we hope you come back next week as we begin a new Christmas teaching series. In fact, the reason we even talk about this around here is because of you. Because we want to be able to continue to provide a great church experience for anybody who walks in those doors, and we want everybody who's a part of Parker Hill Community Church to be part of making that happen each and every week. So if you are part of this church, let me just invite you to think about the part that He may be calling you to play in His mission in this place. Today I want to give you 2 words. And I hope these 2 words will sink deeply into the wrinkles of your brain and that you will never forget them, because I think these 2 words define for us what it means to be a person of radical generosity. Inside your bulletin, there's a note sheet. You can go ahead and take that out, and you can use that as a way to follow along and use it as a place to write some things down that you want to remember and reflect on. Also inside the note sheet, like every week, there are the app notes, and we encourage you to use the app notes throughout the week on your own, in your small group, or around your dinner table to keep learning after we leave here today. I'm going to give you 2 words. The first word is priority. If we want to become radically generous people, we must make giving a priority, not an afterthought. In other words, the first piece of the pie, not the last crumb of our lives. As I unpack this idea, I want to take you to a number of different passages in the Scriptures. You won't be able to keep up in your own Bible, so I would just encourage you to follow along on that note sheet or on the side screens, and then you can go back on your own and explore this a little bit more deeply. As we talk about this idea of priority, I want to talk about 3 things: first fruits, the firstborn, and a first city. That'll make more sense as we go. First of all, the Bible talks about a principle called the principle of first fruits. See, in the days when the Bible was written, almost everybody made their living by growing crops, by farming, and so their income was measured in terms of crops or sometimes in terms of livestock. And the principle of first fruits was simply this: that whenever the harvest was gathered in, the very first part of that harvest was given back to God as an offering to Him. Let me just read through 5 different passages of Scripture where you see this concept. Exodus 23, verse 19, "Bring the best of the first fruits of your soil to the house of the Lord your God." Leviticus 23, "The Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I'm going to give you and reap its harvest, bring to the priest a sheaf of the first grain you harvest." 2 Chronicles 31, this is describing what happens after a great spiritual revival in the nation of Israel. It says, "The Israelites generously gave the first fruits of their grain, new wine, oil, and honey, and all that the fields produced." Nehemiah chapter 10, this is one of the readings in your app notes for this week. And this is after they had rebuilt the city of Jerusalem, and they come together and they say this: "We also assume responsibility for bringing to the house of the Lord each year the first fruits of our crops and of every fruit tree." And then one more, Proverbs 3, verses 9 and 10, a timeless principle here. "Honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all your crops. Then your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim over with new wine." And so what happened was this: as their crops began to produce the first fruit, they would gather that in, the olives or the grapes or the grain or whatever it was they were harvesting, and they would give the first portion of that back to God. And it was a way of saying, God, I just want to show you that I recognize that everything I have ultimately comes from you, and that I want to worship you and show my gratitude by giving back to you the first of everything that you've given to me. Now, this was a huge step of trust. You have to realize that at any point after that, after they gave away the first and the best, a storm could come through and wipe out the rest of the crop. Or a swarm of locusts could come in and destroy most of what was left. But by doing this, they were essentially saying, God, we're giving the first fruits to you, believing that you will take care of us. That was the principle of first fruits. Now, that didn't just apply to their crops. It was also something they did with their livestock, and that was the law or the principle of the firstborn. Let me read you a couple of passages that talk about that. In the book of Exodus, again, chapter 13, it says, after the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanite and gives it to you, as he promised on oath to you and your forefathers, you are to give over to the Lord the first offspring of every womb. All the firstborn males of your livestock belong to the Lord. Deuteronomy 15, same idea is repeated here. Set apart for the Lord your God every firstborn male of your herds and flocks. And so in those days, when one of your animals had its very first male offspring, you would give that animal, that newborn animal, back to God as an act of worship. Now, God didn't say, wait until the animal has 10 offspring and then give me the 10th. He says, no, I want you to give me the very first one. The first fruits were God's, and the firstborn was God's. Now, let me point out something very interesting in the Bible that I never really understood until recently. I'm going to go all the way back to the book of Genesis. In Genesis chapter 4, it tells the story of Cain and Abel. And I didn't really understand this passage until I understood the principle of the first fruit and the firstborn. It never really made sense to me until I understood those two things. Genesis 4, beginning in verse 2, it says this: Now Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. But Abel brought fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. And so Cain was a farmer, and he came and brought an offering to the Lord. But he didn't bring the first fruits. It says here, see what it says, he brought some of the fruits of the soil, inferring that he brought things that were less valuable or left over, maybe even beginning to rot, who knows. Abel, on the other hand, his brother was a rancher, and when he brought God an offering, it says here it came from the firstborn of his flock. And it goes on to say this: the Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. Why? Because Abel gave his first and his best. Cain gave his leftovers. He gave the pie crumbs. Now, I'll give you one more example of this principle, and it applies this time to a city. If you know the history of the people of Israel, you know that when they came into the promised land, they were immediately confronted by the city of Jericho, and they had a battle on their hands. And then through an incredible display of God's power, they defeated the people of Jericho and took the city, but then God gave them some very unusual instructions for what to do with the wealth of that city. Joshua 7, beginning in verse 16. He said, the city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. All the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go into his treasury. See, this is very unusual. Normally, when an army would conquer an enemy city, they would use the wealth of that city to replenish the troops or to provide for their own people. But God said, no, I don't want you to do that. I don't want you to keep any of the wealth from Jericho. I want you to give it all to me. Now, interestingly enough, the people of Israel would go on to fight other battles, and they would go on to conquer other cities. God never gives them the same command again. Do you know why he gave them this command this time? It was the very first city. He said, I want you to know the first city belongs to me. He didn't say, go in and conquer 10 cities and give me the wealth from one of them. He says, give me the wealth of the first city, and then I will provide for you, and I will protect you as you continue on. Do you see the principle there? Do you see the idea? First fruits, the firstborn of first city. And what happened in their hearts was every time they gave the first of what they had to God, it was a reminder to them that he was truly God. and that everything they had came from him ultimately. See, here's the thing about giving that we all need to understand. The primary purpose in giving is not so that God can get money out of our pockets. It's not so that God can get money out of our pockets. It's so that God can get the idols out of our hearts. Because Jesus said, wherever your treasure is, your heart is going to follow. And some of you live on a limited income, and you might think, well, I can't be a very generous person. I don't have much that I can give away. I don't have much that I can use to help other people or advance God's kingdom. I can't really make a difference. That's not true. You can make a difference, especially combined with lots of other people who are trying to make a difference. But most of all, you can make a difference in your own heart, because there is spiritual significance even in the act of giving. When we are generous, it breaks the stranglehold of greed on our hearts. When we are generous, we reject the materialism of our culture. When we give, we demonstrate trust in God. We recognize that He is first in our lives, and that makes a difference in your own heart. So the first word is this: priority. Always make giving a priority in your life, not an afterthought. Make that the first check you write in the month, not the last thing you do if there just happens to be anything left over. Let me give you a second word. The second word is percentage. I must not only make giving a priority, I must make it a percentage. And here's why I say this, because oftentimes when we think about generosity, we think about it in terms of an amount of money. And we see somebody who's very wealthy give a large gift, a large donation to some cause, and we say, wow, that was very generous. Maybe, but maybe not. Because here's how God looks at generosity. He always measures generosity not in terms of how much we give, but how much we give in comparison to how much He's given to us. So God always thinks of generosity not in terms of an amount, but in terms of a percentage. And so there's this principle that you find all throughout the Scripture, and it's a principle that's based on a word that you may be familiar with if you've grown up in church. If not, I'll introduce the word to you. It's the word tithe. T-I-T-H-E, not tithe like necktie, but tithe. And tithe is really a mathematical term. It literally means 1/10. So what tithing meant in the Bible, what it means today, is to give back to God, make that a priority, give back to God the first 10% of what He's entrusted to us. And some of you are already starting to sweat when I just even mention that. You know, once in a while I'll have somebody say to me, and it's, you know, somebody who's got a decent job, a decent paying job, and they'll say, yeah, I tithe $10 a week, which is like saying, I just ran a 2-mile marathon. Think about that. Tithe always means 10%. Now, let me trace this through the Bible for you. The first mention of tithing begins all the way back in the book of Genesis, chapter 14, part of the story of Abraham. And I'll give you the background here before I read this. Abraham's nephew Lot had been taken captive, and Abraham, with 318 men, goes into battle against these incredible odds, and he rescues Lot. Here's what happens next, verse 18. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. Now, this guy Melchizedek in the Bible, it's just kind of mysterious. He kind of shows up on the scene here, and you never read about him again after this. But it tells us a few things about him. It says he was the king of Salem. You know what the word Salem means? It means peace. He was the king of peace. Do you know something? That one of the titles given to Jesus was Prince of Peace. It also says here that Melchizedek brought out bread and wine. On the night before his crucifixion, do you know what Jesus brought out and served to his disciples? Bread and wine. It also says here that Melchizedek was priest of God Most High. Do you know that in the New Testament, Jesus is described, if you're a Christian, he's described as our high priest? The parallels here are amazing, which is why some Bible scholars actually believe that Melchizedek was an appearance of Jesus even before the manger in Bethlehem, which is just kind of mind-boggling. And it goes on to say this, and he blessed Abram, later his name would become Abraham, blessed Abram, saying, blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. In other words, he says, Abram, I just want to remind you that you only won that battle because of God's power and God's strength. And then there's this line, then Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. And so Abraham was so grateful for this victory, he says, in gratitude and thanks and worship, I am going to give a tenth of everything I have. Now that was 400 years before the nation of Israel even existed. So dial ahead the clock, hundreds of years, the nation of Israel eventually comes into existence, and this practice of tithing actually becomes part of their law. Leviticus 27 again, it says a tithe, which means a tenth, of everything from the land, whether grain from the soil or fruit from the trees, belongs to the Lord. It is holy to the Lord. 2 Chronicles chapter 31, the Israelites generously gave the first fruits of their grain, new wine, oil, and honey, and all that the fields produced. They brought a great amount, a tithe of everything. Later on in the Old Testament, you come to the book of Malachi. Malachi was a Jewish prophet, and it was the job of the prophet to speak to the people on behalf of God. And he says this, return to me and I will return to you, says the Lord Almighty. People of Israel had drifted far from God. Their relationship with him was cold. But you ask, how are we to return? Will a man rob God? Yet you rob me. But you ask, how do we rob you? In tithes and offerings. There's that word again. And by the way, these are two different forms of giving. A tithe was that baseline, 10% that they would give back to God. An offering was something that was given of their own free will as their heart moved them. Kind of like what we're doing now through Christmas with this thing called Christmas, Compassionate Christmas. Many of us give to support the work of the church here, but then as our hearts move us, we can also give beyond the walls of this church to make something happen in the lives of other people. But it goes on to say this, verse 9, you are under a curse, the whole nation of you, because you are robbing me. This is God speaking, very strong language. It says, bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. And by the way, the storehouse was another word for the temple, the Jewish temple. And the temple was the focus of God's presence in the world in that day. The focus of God's presence in the world today is the church. And I could make, if I had the time, a pretty strong case for the idea that our primary focus of generosity ought to be the church. And every once in a while somebody will say to me, I think, Mark, God is leading me away from giving to a local church. To which I would say, God would never lead you away from what Jesus died for. Because the church is the bride of Christ. It's the hope of the world. It's the best investment we can ever make with our resources. It goes on to say this, test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that you will not have room enough for it. And over again in Scripture, God says, listen, you give me first place in your life. You make me the priority. You put me first in your life, and I will make sure that you are blessed, not just financially, but spiritually and emotionally, and your favor will be upon my life. Now, whenever I talk about this concept of a tithe or a tenth, oftentimes what people say is this. They will say, Mark, that's part of the Old Testament. We don't live under the law anymore. I'm a Christian, and so I live under grace, not under the law. And here's what I would encourage you to think about. I believe that grace always compels us to do more than the minimum. Always. In fact, Jesus one time was teaching, and he addressed this very subject, and he encouraged his followers not just to do the minimum, what the law required in the Old Testament, but to go above and beyond that. In Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 21, he says, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder. One of the 10 commandments, by the way, as you probably know. Then he goes on to say this, but I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. In other words, Jesus says, listen, the law says don't murder. But if you're one of my followers, I want you to take that further. I want you to not even be angry or to hate your brother or sister. Verse 27, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. That's number 7 of the 10 commandments. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So Jesus says, listen, the law says don't commit adultery. Here's what I want you to do. Don't even think about it. I'm going to give you a higher standard. Verse 38, he said, you have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. See, Jesus never lowered the bar. He always raised it. I think grace expects more from us than the standards of the law in the Old Testament ever did. In fact, in the Old Testament, the only sacrifice that was required for the forgiveness of sins was a lamb. In the New Testament, The forgiveness of sins required the sacrifice of God's own Son. Grace always raises the standard. It doesn't lower it. So number one, make this a priority in your life. You want to be radically generous? Make that a priority and don't look at an amount. Forget about amount. Think of a percentage, and God says, here's a standard for my people. Move toward that. Now, for some of you, to even hear me talk about this, like really freaks you out because you can't even imagine living that way. You can't even imagine making that your priority and being that generous. So let me take you back to the principle that we talked about in week number 1. It's this principle: I am not the owner. And when you understand that, it entirely changes your perspective on generosity because you realize something. God is just calling me to give back to Him what He gave me in the first place. In fact, let me just illustrate this for you. And I need a volunteer. So, Chris, I see you sitting right there in the front row. Come on up these stairs over here, Chris, and join me up here on the platform in front of the camera. And come on in, Chris. Don't be nervous. Were you here 2 weeks ago?
Yep.
Did you get some money?
Yep.
How much?
$1.
$1. This is your lucky day. I have 10 $1 bills right here, and I'm going to give these to you. Okay?
Yeah.
You good with that?
Yeah.
Good. All right. What do you say?
Thank you.
Thank you. Good. Are you really thankful?
Yeah.
Really?
Uh-huh.
If you're really thankful, would you mind giving one of those back to me?
Sure.
No problem with that?
No.
You sure?
Yeah.
Why?
Because it's not mine.
All right. Yeah, I think he's got it. Okay. You can have a seat. Thanks for helping out, Chris. Give Chris a hand. See, imagine if I had Chris come up here and I give him the 10 $1 bills and I say, "Can I have one of those back?" And he says, "What? One of my 10 bills? You want one back? I need all 10 of those." No, you can't have one back. That would seem pretty ridiculous because the connection was so close. I gave it to him. It was very clear, very visible, and I asked for one back. It's sometimes not so clear in our own hearts, and we struggle with that idea, this biblical idea of a tithe. So if you want to be a radically generous person, you want to make a difference in this world, you want to advance God's kingdom, number one, you got to make giving a priority, not an afterthought. And number two, you look at it as a percentage, not as an amount. I came across a news story a couple of months ago, and it's a reminder of what can happen when we make generosity a habit of our lives. And it's a story about a man by the name of Albert Lexie. Albert Lexie shines shoes for a living. It's the only job he's ever had. And he sets up his shoe shine stand every day at the Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh. He only charges $5 per pair of shoes. And his rates are so reasonable that many people give him a tip. Since the day he began shining shoes in that hospital, he has donated every single tip to the Children's Hospital Free Care Fund, which helps parents who can't afford to pay the medical bills for their children. But Albert is just a shoe shine man. That's all he is. How much could a shoe shine man really give? So far, he's donated over $200,000 to the Children's Hospital Free Care Fund. See, even a small amount, and he's the shoe shine guy, even a small amount given faithfully can add up to a powerful, powerful legacy. See, I want us to be radically generous people. It doesn't take a great deal of wealth. All it means is this: that I'm going to make that a priority in my life, and I'm going to make a percentage of everything I have go back to God's kingdom. Now, as we come to the end of this message and the end of this series, I want to give you a chance to respond to what you've heard. So let me point out a couple of things in your bulletin today. First of all, there is this blue bulletin insert. If you have questions about what we've talked about today in the last couple of weeks, I would encourage you to read through this and get hopefully all of your questions answered, or at least most of them. But then inside your bulletin is this card. I want you to go ahead and take this out, everybody. Okay, if you got a bulletin when you came in, go ahead and take this card out with me. I want to make this an all play, okay? Just take this out, get it in front of you. Now, again, if you're not a believer, if you've never surrendered your life to Christ, I'm not talking to you in the next few minutes, so you can just kind of watch and observe and leave it at that. But if you're a believer, I want to encourage you to really, really wrestle with this. I want you to ask yourself this question: what is the next step that God may be calling me to take toward radical generosity. On the opposite side of where you see the pie, on the back side, let me just go over some things there with you. First of all, there's a diagram there, the 10-10-80 rule. Just read through that sometime, because if you can structure your life that way, you will always be in a great place. But under that, there's this thing that says commitment reminder. As an act of faith and obedience, I committed to, and there's 3 boxes there. Let me talk through them very briefly. Number 1 would be the box that says giving the first blank percent of my income back to God. What is the next step that God may be calling you to take? Maybe you're a person who's never, ever taken this seriously, and to be honest, when it comes to really giving, it's pretty close to 0. And maybe jumping all the way to 10% is something you can't even fathom at this time because your finances are so upside down. So maybe you're going to take a step in that direction and say, you know what, beginning today, I'm going to pick 4% of my income, 5% of my income. I'm going to start giving that. And then work my way in that direction. Or maybe you're there and you just need to move up toward what the Bible calls a tithe, which is 10%. Maybe some of you giving 10% really isn't a stretch for you, because the 90% you've got left, God has blessed you so incredibly that you live very, very, very comfortably on that. And maybe you're going to say, you know what? God has blessed me so much, I'm going to move beyond even 10%. What is that next step for you? Maybe it's 0 to 3 or 3 to 6. Just think about that and make a decision. Make that a priority and not an amount. Think of a percentage moving in that direction. Then the second thing is this. It says, become consistent in my giving by giving online. I actually did this. Okay, honest confession. I get really busy. I don't pay attention. Then I'll look at my giving record and realize I'm way behind and I have to catch up. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to take care of that. And we have this thing on our website where you can start giving online, and it can be a recurring payment. So if you really want to make sure this is a priority in your life, you can set it up so that once or twice a month, that automatically goes from your bank account into God's kingdom. And I decided to do that so that I don't even have to think about it anymore. I think about it this way. Automation always trumps determination. Automation always trumps determination. So if you're serious about this, pick a percentage, go home today, go online, figure out that percentage, how that works, fill out the form online, and just make that start happening. Third box, by increasing my giving by blank percent over the next 6 months, you may say, you know what, I got to go home, get my financial house in order, but within the next 6 months, I'm going to take this step right here. Okay? Now, here's what I want you to do. Turn that over. You're going to see the same 3 boxes on the front. And all together, we're going to do something now, okay? You're going to bend that at the perforation, bend it back and forth. Go ahead. Even if you don't plan to turn it in, bend it. 1, 2, 3. Tear it. Very good. Now, the front of that has those same 3 boxes, so you can check a box. And then just to remind you what box you checked and what you filled out, you can fill out the My Commitment part on the other side. Take this home, and we're actually going to collect these in a few minutes. Now, we're not collecting those because we're going to track anything, because there's not even a space to put your name on there. This is a decision that you need to make between you and God. What is generosity going to look like in my life? What is the next step He's calling me to take? But I believe that by physically filling that out and by turning that in and by putting that in an offering plate, that will just cement that decision in our hearts in a way that we won't forget it. So I want you to do that. There's a pen nearby you. You can just fill out the part that you turn in and the part that you keep, just so you know what step you're taking. And I believe that God will honor whatever step toward generosity you take. Now, here's what's going to happen in the next few minutes. I'm going to wrap up, and then we're going to let you hear from a young lady by the name of Christy. Christy's a single mom, been through some very challenging times in her life, but in spite of her circumstances, she made a decision to honor God in this part of her life. And I want you to hear her story. And right after you get to hear her story, right after that video, the band's going to come back, and they're going to play for about 2 minutes to give you some time to think about that and fill that out if you're part of this church, or to talk it over briefly if you need to with your spouse. And then we're going to close with a song. When the band starts to sing, we'll join in, close with a song, and the ushers are going to come back, and they're just going to collect that little tear-off portion. Again, no need to put your name on it. We're not tracking that, but it's an act of worship, an act of commitment. God, here's what I want to do in response to your goodness to me. And we're actually going to collect that in pie plates. So you get the connection, don't you? Okay? So Let me end with this. John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. See, our generosity is a result of our theology. We give because God gave. We give because we follow a Savior who gave everything. And I will say this, I don't want to live my life in the shadow of a bloodstained cross and not be a radically generous person. Watch this with me.
I have twins that are 7 years old, and divorced single mother, doing it completely on my own. About a year and a half ago, my friend had invited me to come to church, so I started coming. And I was baptized, I think, 4 months ago. And yeah, I've been coming probably every single Sunday for the last year and a half and love it, and my boys love it, and it's made a big difference in our lives. I had a friend that I was talking to, and she was telling me how she tithed, and she was like, you just can't be blessed unless that's something that you're willing to do, especially, she kind of talked about how when you're on your walk with God that you get challenged throughout. And, in the beginning, it maybe is a little simpler, and then the more you go along, the more you get challenged to kind of stand up for what you believe in. And so she had been kind of, in my ear about it, and then I had heard the sermon about it, I decided to get baptized, and I just kind of felt like it was the next commitment that I needed to make, that God was calling me to make. And I'm looking at my finances, and I'm like, I don't really know how this is gonna float, because really at the end of the month, there wasn't much left over to begin with. So I finally just came to the point where I was just like, you know what, I'm just gonna do it, and it'll just figure itself out, which, sometimes I guess is a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing, I don't know. But I was just like, you know what, if God really wants me to tithe, then he'll figure it out. I mean, at first I was like, well, I'm doing the right thing. And that's kind of what I kept telling myself. And I don't know if it's what it is, but kind of after the first or second week, I'm happy to give it. I'm just like, okay, it's not really mine anyway. I had been covering for a girl that was out sick for work, and she had decided not to come back. So my boss called me in, and she was like, you're doing a great job. We really like you here. And we've decided that we're going to give you a little bit more responsibilities. So the girl that's not coming back, we'd like you to take over her position, some of her territories. And, also paired with the fact that we really like you and you're doing well, we're going to give you a 20% raise. So they gave me a 20% raise, and that was pretty much a month after I started tithing, which, I'm not saying that will happen for everybody that tithes, but it definitely was a blessing for me, and I felt like it was a direct result of me following what I needed to do. And I believe God influences you the way you need to be at the right time. And I think that certain things come across your path, you hear certain things, maybe you read things during your daily devotionals, maybe a friend starts talking to you about it. That's what's always happened to me. I've heard something in church, and that's kind of reaffirmed later in what I'm reading, or a conversation that I'm having with a friend. I feel like if you are feeling burdened or influenced to make that decision, pray about it, and that will really help you come to the decision that you need to make. It's definitely not an easy choice, but I don't think it's meant to be either. I think in your relationship with God, there are times where you have to make sacrifices, and you have to, step out in faith and maybe do things like I'm doing right now that are a little uncomfortable for you. But I think there's always a reason for it. There's always a purpose behind it, and God's asking you to do that for a reason. So I think you need to listen to that and be in tune with it.